My husband threw me out after believing his daughter lies. 3 weeks later, he asked if I'd reflected. I gave him divorce papers, and his daughter lost it. I'm standing in my driveway, watching my clothes fly out of the second-story window, and I still can't process what's happening. My husband, Carlin, is screaming from up there, his face red with rage I've never seen before, telling me to get out of his house. Just this morning, we were having coffee together. Just this morning, everything was fine. But now, his 17-year-old daughter, Alora, is standing behind him with this look on her face, this expression I can't quite read, something between triumph and fake concern. She's putting her hand on his shoulder like she's comforting him, but her eyes meet mine for just a second, and I swear I see a smirk. Let me back up and explain how I got to this nightmare moment. I met Carlin 4 years ago at a coffee shop where he worked as a manager. He was this calm, kind widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years prior. Elora was 13 then, a quiet girl who seemed lost without her mother. I fell for Carlin hard and fast. We dated for 8 months before I proposed, and he said yes with tears in his eyes. I promised him and Alora that I'd never try to replace her mother, but I'd be there for both of them, always. The first 2 years were honestly great. Alora was distant with me, sure, but I understood. I never pushed, never demanded she call me mom or anything like that. I helped her with homework when she asked, drove her to her friends' houses, paid for her phone and clothes. I bought us a bigger house so she could have her own space. Carlin was happy, we were happy, and I thought Alora was adjusting. But looking back now, I can see when things started to shift, when the poison started dripping. About 8 or 9 months ago, Alora started making these little comments to her father. I'd hear them sometimes when I walked into a room, little things that sounded sweet on the surface but had this edge to them. She'd tell him how handsome he was, how he could be a model, how he deserved someone who treated him like a king. I thought it was just a kid complimenting her dad, or she'd bring up her dead mother whenever Carlin and I set any kind of boundary, saying her mom would have let her do whatever it was she wanted. At first, Carlin would shut it down firmly, telling her to stop, that I was good to them, but the comments kept coming, subtle and constant, like water dripping on stone. She'd question why they had to follow my rules in what she called their house. I tried to talk to Carlin about it, suggesting that Alora might be having trouble adjusting, but he waved it off as typical teenage drama. But I noticed him looking at me differently sometimes, like he was studying me, searching for something. Then about 4 months ago, things got weirder. Alora would be this completely different person, depending on whether her father was in the room. When Carlin was around, she'd be laughing and joking with me, acting like we were buddies. But the second he left, her face would go blank, completely neutral, like I didn't exist. I'd try to engage with her, suggest activities we could do together, and she'd just give me these flat, one-word responses. Then Carlin would come back, and suddenly she'd be animated again. I started feeling crazy, like I was imagining the whole thing. The real explosion started 3 months ago when Alora asked me for a car. Not just any car, but a $35,000 BMW like her friend had. I sat her down and explained that was too much money, that we could find her a reliable used car for around $10,000, and she could get a part-time job to help with insurance. She stared at me like I'd slapped her, then stormed off to her room where I could hear her crying. That night, Carlin was ice cold, questioning whether it was really necessary to deny her, pointing out everything she'd been through, and asking if it would kill me to just give her this one thing. I was shocked. shocked because $35,000 for a teenager's first car was objectively insane, but he just turned away and said I didn't understand what it was like to be her father. After that incident, everything changed, like a switch had been flipped. Alora started having these whispered conversations with her father that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. Carlin began questioning me out of nowhere, asking if I really liked Alora, why she felt like I was different when he wasn't around. I tried to defend myself, explaining that I was exactly the same person all the time, but he'd counter by asking why his daughter would lie. The fights became regular occurrences. Alora would claim I'd said something harsh to her, and Carlin would confront me about it. Every time I tried to defend myself, he'd ask if I was calling his daughter a liar, and I felt completely trapped. I realized she was playing this perfectly, making vague claims that were impossible to disprove, building this narrative of me as a two-faced abuser who only showed her true colors when we were alone. Then 2 weeks ago, everything exploded in the worst possible way. I came home from work, and Carlin grabbed my arm, his voice shaking as he said we needed to talk about what happened with Alora. My stomach dropped because I had no idea what he was talking about. He pulled up Alora's sleeve to show me a bruise on her forearm, tears in his eyes as he told me she'd said I grabbed her, that I'd been getting aggressive when he wasn't home. My world tilted, and I felt panic rising in my chest because I had never ever laid a hand on that girl. I was shouting now, desperate, but he stepped back from me like I was dangerous. He told me he hadn't wanted to believe Alora, that for months he'd told himself she was just being a dramatic teenager, but the things she'd been telling him were too specific and too consistent to ignore. I grabbed his hands, begging him to think about whether he'd ever seen me be violent in 4 years together, but he pulled away and said that was what made it so scary, that Alora claimed I was like two different people. That's when I saw Alora watching from the stairs, and for just a split second, her expression was completely neutral, almost curious, like she was watching a science experiment to see how it would turn out. Then she saw me looking, and her face instantly crumpled into fear. She ran down the stairs, calling for her dad, saying she'd heard yelling and begging him not to let me hurt her. That performance was what broke Carlin completely. He told me to pack a bag and leave, that until he could figure things out and make sure his daughter was safe, I needed to get out. I packed with shaking hands, my mind reeling, trying to understand how my marriage had just imploded. As I loaded my car, I looked up one more time and saw them in the window. Alora had her arm around her father, comforting him like the devoted daughter. But when she thought I couldn't see her face clearly, she was looking down at her phone and smiling. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, this wasn't a misunderstanding or a kid acting out. This was calculated and planned. And as I drove to my sister's house with my entire life in trash bags in my back seat, one question kept repeating in my mind like a hammer. How long had this 17-year-old girl been planning to destroy my marriage? And more importantly, why? I spent the first week at my sister's house in complete shock, barely eating, barely sleeping, just replaying everything in my mind over and over. My sister, Nora, kept telling me to fight back, to call Carlin, to make him listen. But what was the point when he'd already decided I was the monster in this story? I must have called him 50 times that first week, and every single call went straight to voicemail. I texted him, begging for a chance to talk, to explain, to show him that something was very wrong with Alora's story, but he never responded. By the second week, the shock started wearing off, and something else took its place. Something cold and analytical. I started thinking about all those little moments over the past months, all those weird interactions that hadn't made sense at the time. Alora's performance on the stairs, that split second of curiosity before she put on her terrified act. It was too smooth, too practiced. That bruise on her arm had appeared at the perfect time, right after our biggest fight about the car and those whispered conversations with her father that stopped when I entered rooms. What had she been filling his head with all those months? I realized I needed help, real, professional help, because if Alora had been manipulating the situation this whole time, I needed proof. I called a lawyer first, a family law attorney named Dana Voss, who came highly recommended. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes, and when I finished, she looked at me seriously and asked if I owned the house. I told her yes. I'd bought it before the marriage with my own money. She nodded and said that was good, that it gave me leverage, but we needed to move quickly on the divorce paperwork if that's what I wanted. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that part of me still hoped Carlin would come to his senses, and she gave me this sad smile. In my experience, when someone chooses to believe the worst about you without evidence, they've already made their choice. That hit me hard, but I knew she was right. Then I hired a private investigator, a man named Mason Keene, who specialized in family and fraud cases. I felt ridiculous at first, like I was being paranoid, but I told him everything about Alora's behavior, the manipulation, the lies. Mason didn't seem surprised at all. He told me he'd seen cases like this before. Kids who manipulated parents during remarriages or blended families. Teenagers can be incredibly sophisticated manipulators when they want something, he said. Let me look into the finances first, see if there's a money trail, because there usually is. It took Mason less than a week to find the first bombshell. Our joint account, the one Carlin and I had set up for household expenses and savings, had been bleeding money for almost 6 months. $8,000 in total, withdrawn in increments small enough that I hadn't noticed while I was working 60-hour weeks. The charges were for gaming equipment, expensive clothes, electronics, food delivery orders, sometimes twice a day, all of it tied back to Alora. But here's what made my blood run cold. Carlin had to have known. Several of the charges required parental approval, and there were bank statements showing he transferred money from our savings to cover the overdrafts Alora had created. He'd been hiding it from me, covering for her, probably because he knew I'd say no to that kind of spending. Mason found something else, too. He pulled our credit report and found that Carlin had applied for a credit card in just his name 2 months ago, right around the time Alora's campaign against me had intensified. He'd maxed it out almost immediately, another $4,000, mostly on stuff for Alora. When Mason showed me the evidence, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. This wasn't just about Alora manipulating her father. Carlin had been actively deceiving me too, choosing his daughter over our marriage and our financial future. But the real gold mine came when Mason suggested we look into Alora's social media and digital footprint. He had a contact who could access deleted messages and posts, all perfectly legal with the right tools. I gave him the go-ahead, even though it felt invasive, because I needed to know the truth. What we found was devastating. Messages between Alora and her friends going back almost a year, talking about her plan. My dad's starting to doubt her, one message said. Just got to push a little harder, and she's gone. In another conversation, Alora literally wrote out her strategy. Dad always believes me when I cry. It's so easy, she told her friend Lacey. There were messages about the car too, about how I was a cheap woman who didn't understand that she deserved nice things. But the worst message, the one that made everything crystal clear, was from 3 weeks ago, right before everything exploded. Almost there, Alora had written. Got the bruise ready, going to show Dad tonight. This should be the final nail in the coffin. She'd planned a bruise. She deliberately hurt herself to frame me. Mason found a video too, hidden in Alora's cloud storage, probably recorded by accident. It showed Elora in her bathroom, slamming her own forearm against the edge of the counter, wincing, but doing it again and again until a dark bruise formed. "This better work," she muttered to herself in the video. I sat there watching this 17-year-old girl abuse herself to destroy my marriage, and I felt physically sick. Why would someone do this? What had I done to deserve this level of calculated cruelty? Then Mason showed me the final piece of the puzzle, messages between Elora and her best friend about their plan for after the divorce. "Once they split, Dad will want to leave this boring town," Elora wrote. "He'll sell the house, and we can finally move to the city where everything actually happens. Plus, without her around, he'll have more money to spend on me." It was all about money and location. Elora wanted a different life, a more exciting life in the city where her friends had moved, and I was the obstacle. The house was in my name, so Carlin couldn't sell it while we were married. But if we divorced, Elora figured he'd want a fresh start somewhere else, and she'd finally get what she wanted. I had everything: the financial fraud, the manipulative messages, the video of her creating the bruise, all of it. Dana looked over everything and told me this was more than enough for a divorce with a very favorable settlement. But she warned me that exposing Elora's manipulation might damage my relationship with Carlin permanently. I almost laughed because what relationship? The man had thrown me out based on lies without even giving me a chance to defend myself. That night, 3 weeks after he'd kicked me out, I finally got a text from Carlin. "Have you had time to think about your behavior?" it read. "Elora says she's willing to give you another chance if you apologize to her and commit to doing better. We can talk about you coming home if you've really reflected on what you've done." I stared at that message for a long time. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He wasn't apologizing for not hearing my side. He was demanding I apologize to the girl who'd orchestrated this entire nightmare. I texted back just 4 words. "Come over tomorrow, 3 p.m. He responded immediately. "Does this mean you're ready to make things right?" I didn't answer. Instead, I spent the rest of the night organizing all the evidence into a folder, printing out the messages, the bank statements, everything. Tomorrow, Carlin was going to learn the truth about his daughter, and our marriage was going to end. There was no coming back from this. Carlin arrived at the coffee shop at exactly 3 p.m., and I watched him through the window as he parked his car. He looked tired, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. For a moment, I felt a pain of the love I'd had for him. But then I remembered the past 3 weeks of silence, the accusations, the way he'd chosen to believe the worst of me without question. He walked toward the entrance with this expression on his face, half hopeful and half nervous, probably expecting me to be broken and apologetic. I chose this coffee shop deliberately because it was neutral territory, a public place where neither of us had the advantage, and I wanted witnesses for what was about to happen. He spotted me at a corner table in the back and made his way over, sliding into the seat across from me with a cautious smile. The coffee shop was busy enough that we had privacy, but not so empty that we were alone, and I positioned myself so I could see the parking lot through the window. He started talking almost immediately about how he and Elora had been discussing things, how maybe if I was willing to go to therapy and work on my anger issues, we could find a way forward. I let him talk for about 30 seconds before I held up my hand to stop him and slid a large manila folder across the small table. He looked at it, confused, then back at me with questions in his eyes. I told him to open it, my voice flat and emotionless. He hesitated, then picked up the folder with shaking hands. The first thing he saw was the divorce paperwork, official and already signed by my lawyer. His face went white, and he looked up at me with genuine shock. starting to say we could work through this. I just told him to keep looking. He flipped through the pages, and I watched his face change as he saw the bank statements, the credit card bills, the highlighted charges that showed $8,000 of our money spent by Alora. He tried to explain, but I cut him off and told him to keep going. Then he got to the printed messages, Alora's conversations with her friends, where she'd laid out her entire manipulation strategy. I saw the exact moment he read the words his daughter had written about how easy it was to make him believe her, how the old woman would be gone soon. His hands started trembling, and he kept shaking his head like he could deny what was right in front of him. He whispered that it couldn't be real, that these could be fake. That's when I pulled out my phone and played the video with the volume low enough that only he could hear. Alora's voice came through clearly as she slammed her own arm against the bathroom counter over and over, creating the bruise she'd shown her father. Carlin's face crumbled, and he dropped the papers onto the table, his hand over his mouth. He was mumbling about how she'd told him I grabbed her, how she'd cried and seemed so scared. I interrupted him to explain coldly that she'd played him, that for months she'd been systematically destroying our marriage because she wanted him to sell my house and move to the city with her, and it was all there in the messages. He was silent now, staring at the table, his whole body heavy with disbelief. Then he asked why I hadn't made him see, why I hadn't told him, and that question broke something in me. I told him I had tried, that I'd begged him to talk to me, but he'd chosen to believe Alora without evidence, without even asking for my side of the story. He'd thrown me out of my own house based on lies. He reached across the table for my hand, but I pulled back, and he said desperately that he was protecting his child, asking what he was supposed to do. "You were supposed to be my husband," I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and remembered where we were. "You were supposed to give me the benefit of the doubt after 4 years of marriage." The words that came next were ones I'd been holding in for 3 weeks. I told him he was supposed to ask questions, demand proof, something, but he didn't because deep down he'd already chosen Alora over me. The truth hung in the air between us, painful and undeniable. He'd made his choice weeks ago, maybe even months ago, when Alora's whispered poison had first started working on him, and I was just the collateral damage. That's when the coffee shop door opened with force, and Alora walked in. She'd been waiting in the car outside, and apparently couldn't stand not knowing what was happening. She spotted us immediately and stormed over to our table, her face red with anger, demanding to know what I was doing to her dad. Then she saw the papers scattered on the table, and her expression changed. For just a second, I saw real fear before she tried to recover and tell her father that whatever I was saying was a lie, that I was trying to turn him against her. I picked up my phone and turned the screen toward her, showing her her own video of creating the bruise. Her face went through a series of emotions in rapid succession: shock, panic, then finally settling on anger. She said loudly that I'd gone through her stuff, that I had no right, and people in the coffee shop were starting to look at us. I kept my voice calm and told her she'd framed me for abuse, so I had every right. Carlin was staring at his daughter like he'd never seen her before, his voice breaking as he begged her to tell him it wasn't real, that she didn't do this. And that's when Alora's mask finally came off completely. "So what if I did?" she said, her voice getting louder and drawing more attention. She said he was miserable with me anyway, that I was boring and cheap and not her mom, that they should have left this stupid town a year ago. Carlin gasped like he'd been physically struck, his eyes darting around at the other customers who were now openly staring. Alora kept going, seemingly not caring about the audience, saying she did what she had to do because all her friends had moved to the city and she was stuck here because of me. She told her father he deserved better than this boring life that they both did, and once he divorced me and sold the house, they could finally have a real life. I interrupted quietly to remind her that it was my house, and Carlin couldn't sell it. Her face went even redder, and she started talking about lawsuits and how her friend's mom had gotten half of everything in her divorce. That's when I saw the moment Carlin finally understood what his daughter had become, right there in the middle of a crowded coffee shop. He whispered that she destroyed his marriage for money and a change of location, that she'd made him believe his wife was abusing her so they could move to be near her friends. Alora tried to backtrack, suddenly aware of all the people watching, stammering that it wasn't like that she just wanted them to be happy together. I cut through all of it and told them both the reality of their situation. I explained firmly but quietly that they had 30 days to find a place as stated in the divorce papers, and after that, I was taking back my house. Carlin looked at me with such devastation in his eyes and begged for time to process this, to fix what had been broken, but I was done. I told him there was nothing to fix, that he'd chosen to believe I was a monster without evidence, that he'd let his daughter manipulate him for months and never once questioned it. Even now, knowing the truth, he was asking me for another chance. But the painful reality was that he'd never given me a first chance. Carlin broke down completely, tears in his eyes, while Alora stood there with her arms crossed, looking defiant and angry, even though her entire scheme had collapsed around her. I watched them, this father and daughter who destroyed my trust and my marriage, and felt nothing but emptiness where love used to be. I stood up from the table, gathered my copy of the divorce papers, and told them I was leaving. I repeated that they had 30 days to move out of my house. Carlin tried to grab my arm, but I pulled away gently and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Carlin's sobs and Alora starting to argue with him, her voice rising again as she probably tried to spin this somehow. I walked out of that coffee shop and got in my car, and through the window, I could see them still at the table. Carlin with his head in his hands, crying, while Alora gestured angrily, probably still blaming me for everything, even as the evidence of her manipulation sat right there in front of them. A month later, my lawyer called to confirm they'd moved out on time. They'd found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town, nothing like the house they'd left behind. Dana mentioned that Carlin had tried to fight for some financial settlement, but had no legal ground to stand on since the house was mine before the marriage, and he'd been complicit in the misuse of $8,000. Nora told me through mutual friends that Carlin was devastated, barely functioning at work, that Alora was making his life miserable by blaming him for not moving faster, for not selling the house somehow, for ruining her plan. Their relationship was apparently strained to the breaking point, with Alora treating him with the same manipulative contempt she'd shown me. Part of me felt sad about it sometimes, late at night when my house was too quiet, and I'd remember the good times before Alora's poison had taken root, but mostly I felt relief, like I'd dodged a bullet that would have eventually destroyed me. You can't build a marriage with someone who doesn't trust you, and you can't love someone who will throw you away the moment it becomes convenient. I'd learned the hardest lesson of my life, one that cost me 4 years in a marriage I'd thought would last forever. Trust without communication isn't real trust, it's just blind faith. And blind faith without evidence or questions is dangerous. Alora had taught me that lesson in the cruelest way possible, and now both she and Carlin were living with the consequences of the lies they'd chosen to believe and the loyalty they'd chosen wrong. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments. Drop a like and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.